My name is Bethany Palmer. I'm 31 years old, and 3 days ago I stood on the front porch of the house I legally own, watching my father Eugene change the locks, while my mother Denise told me through the closed door, "You are not part of this family anymore. Don't come back." I had my house key in my hand, the key that no longer worked because they'd replaced the locks on the property I had purchased 4 years ago to save them from bank foreclosure and homelessness. I'm a successful medical device sales representative here in Columbus, Ohio, and 4 years ago, I quietly bought my parents' home when they were 3 months away from losing everything, allowing them to continue living there without paying rent or mortgage, while I covered all the expenses, and their gratitude for saving them from financial ruin was to lock me out of my own property while declaring I was no longer their daughter. The irony of being expelled from a house that legally belongs to me by people who would be homeless without my financial intervention wasn't just painful. It was about to become the most expensive mistake my parents would ever make, because what they didn't understand as they changed those locks was that illegally evicting the actual property owner has serious legal consequences that their attorney Mitchell Crawford was about to explain to them in excruciating detail. The devastation of hearing my own mother tell me I wasn't family anymore while standing on property I owned was compounded by the realization that my parents genuinely believed they had the right to expel me from my own house, as if 4 years of living there had somehow transferred legal ownership from me to them, despite all the documentation proving otherwise. I stood there on that porch watching my father work on the new lock mechanism, listening to my mother's voice from inside telling me to leave and never return, and I felt a strange combination of heartbreak and clarity. The heartbreak came from understanding that my parents' resentment of depending on me had grown so intense that they'd rather pretend I didn't exist than acknowledge that their housing security depended entirely on my financial generosity. The clarity came from realizing that people who would illegally lock you out of property you own while declaring you're not family deserve every legal consequence that was about to rain down on them. Have you ever purchased property to save your parents from homelessness, only to be locked out of that same property 4 years later while being told you're no longer part of the family? That's exactly what I experienced as I watched Eugene install new deadbolts on the front door of the house whose mortgage I'd been paying for 48 consecutive months, while Denise stood inside telling me through the door that I needed to accept I wasn't welcome in their home anymore and that I should move on with my life and stop trying to control them through property ownership. Growing up in our Columbus family, I had always been the responsible, ambitious daughter who worked hard and planned for the future, while my parents Eugene and Denise had been loving but financially careless, making poor decisions about money and accumulating debt, without considering the long-term consequences of their spending habits. Throughout my childhood and teenage years, I watched them struggle with credit card debt, car loans they couldn't afford, and lifestyle choices that exceeded their modest income. They would buy expensive furniture on credit, take vacations they couldn't pay for, and make impulsive purchases that drained their savings and prevented them from building any financial security for their retirement years. My father worked as a warehouse supervisor, earning a decent middle-class salary, while my mother worked part-time at a retail store, contributing additional income to the household. Together, they should have been able to live comfortably and build savings, but their inability to budget responsibly or delay gratification meant they were always living paycheck to paycheck despite having adequate income. I learned early in life that I didn't want to follow their financial example, so I focused on education, career development, and building the kind of financial stability that would allow me to weather economic challenges and plan for my future. After graduating from college with a degree in business administration, I entered the medical device sales field and discovered I had a natural talent for building relationships with healthcare professionals and explaining complex technical products in ways that helped doctors understand how the devices could benefit their patients. Within 5 years, I was one of the top performers in my company, earning a 6-figure income that allowed me to purchase my own home, build substantial savings, and invest for retirement. My success was the result of hard work, strategic career choices, and financial discipline that my parents had never demonstrated in their own lives. 4 years ago, when I was 27 years old, my parents contacted me with devastating news. They were facing foreclosure on their home after falling behind on mortgage payments due to a combination of reduced income, accumulated debt, and financial mismanagement. My father's hours at the warehouse had been cut, my mother had health issues that forced her to reduce her work schedule, and they had no emergency savings to cover the gap between their reduced income and their monthly expenses. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage, had received foreclosure notices from the bank, and were approximately 60 days away from losing the house they'd lived in for 18 years. The news hit me hard, because despite my frustration with their financial irresponsibility over the years, I didn't want to see them become homeless or lose the family home where I'd grown up. When they explained the situation and asked if I could help them catch up on the missed payments, I initially considered just giving them the money to bring the mortgage current. But after reviewing their financial situation in detail, I realized that even if I caught up the arrears, they wouldn't be able to afford the ongoing mortgage payments with their reduced income, which meant they would just fall behind again in a few months and face the same foreclosure threat. After consulting with my financial advisor and real estate attorney, I made a decision that I believed was generous and practical. I would purchase their house outright, paying off the entire mortgage and taking ownership of the property, while allowing my parents to continue living there without paying rent or mortgage. This arrangement would eliminate their housing expenses entirely, giving them the financial breathing room they needed to recover from their income reduction and get their finances back on track. I explained my plan to them carefully, emphasizing that this was a gift designed to ensure they would never face foreclosure or housing insecurity again. My parents' initial reaction to my proposal was mixed. On one hand, they were relieved to avoid foreclosure and grateful for the financial rescue. On the other hand, I could see the discomfort in their eyes as they processed the reality that their daughter would own their home, and they would essentially be living in my property. "So we'd be like your tenants?" my mother asked, her voice revealing her discomfort with the power dynamic this arrangement would create. "You'd be the landlord, and we'd be living in your house?" I tried to reassure them that I wasn't thinking of our relationship in landlord-tenant terms, but rather as a family arrangement where I would help them maintain housing security while they worked to improve their financial situation. "I'm not going to charge you rent or make you sign a lease," I explained. "You'll continue living in the house exactly as you have been, but without the stress of mortgage payments or the risk of foreclosure. Think of this as me investing in our family's security and ensuring you have a stable place to live regardless of what happens with your income or expenses." Despite my reassurances, I could sense that my parents were uncomfortable with the arrangement and what it represented about their financial dependence on their daughter. In their minds, parents were supposed to help their children, not the other way around. The role reversal where I was rescuing them from financial disaster challenged their self-image and created resentment that would only grow over the following years. The purchase transaction was completed within 6 weeks, with me paying off the remaining mortgage balance of $138,000 and covering all the closing costs, title transfers, and legal fees associated with the property transfer. I received the deed, title, and all legal documentation proving my ownership of the property, while my parents continued living there exactly as they had before, with the only difference being that they no longer had mortgage payments to make each month. I genuinely believed I was doing something generous and helpful for my family, solving their immediate financial crisis while also providing long-term housing security that would allow them to recover from their reduced income and rebuild their financial stability. What I didn't anticipate was how much my parents would resent the situation and how that resentment would poison our relationship over the following years. The first year after I purchased the house, my parents seemed grateful for the rescue and appreciative of the financial relief of not having mortgage payments. They would thank me during family gatherings and acknowledge that my help had saved them from a terrible situation. But gradually, their gratitude began to shift into something darker, a resentment of their dependence on me, and a discomfort with the fact that their adult daughter owned the roof over their heads. By the second year, the dynamic had changed significantly. My parents stopped thanking me for the arrangement, and instead began acting as if the house was still theirs, making decisions about renovations and changes without consulting me despite my legal ownership. When I gently reminded them that major decisions about the property should involve me since I was the owner, they reacted defensively and accused me of trying to control them or treat them like tenants rather than family members. "This is still our home, Bethany," my father would say whenever I raised questions about property decisions. Just because your name is on the deed doesn't mean you get to dictate how we live or what we do with our house. The possessive language they used, our home, our house, revealed that they had mentally reverted to thinking of themselves as the owners, despite the legal reality that I held the title and had purchased the property to save them from foreclosure. My mother's resentment manifested differently but was equally problematic. She would make comments during family gatherings about how hard it is to live in someone else's house, or how difficult it is to feel like a guest in your own home, framing their situation as if I had somehow victimized them rather than rescued them from homelessness. She would compare their situation to friends who owned their own homes, expressing envy and bitterness about their loss of property ownership without acknowledging that they had lost the house through their own financial mismanagement and would have lost it to the bank if I hadn't intervened. The third year brought even more tension as my parents' resentment intensified, and they began treating me not as their daughter who had saved them, but as an unwelcome reminder of their financial failure and dependence. Family gatherings became uncomfortable as they would make passive-aggressive comments about property ownership, financial control, and their loss of independence. They stopped inviting me to visit the house casually, making it clear that my presence reminded them of their situation and made them uncomfortable. During this period, I noticed that extended family members, my aunt and uncle, cousins, and family friends, seemed to be hearing a very different version of the story from my parents. Instead of explaining that I had purchased the house to save them from foreclosure, my parents were apparently telling people that I had taken advantage of their financial difficulties to steal their house, and now lorded my ownership over them by reminding them it was my property. The narrative they were creating painted me as a manipulative daughter who had used their vulnerability to gain control over them, rather than a generous child who had sacrificed her own savings to rescue them from homelessness. The distorted narrative my parents created about our arrangement was deeply hurtful because it completely reversed the reality of what had happened and who had helped whom. But more concerning was the way this narrative seemed to be turning extended family members against me, with some relatives expressing concern that I was taking advantage of Eugene and Denise or treating them like tenants in their own home. The fact that my parents were actively undermining my reputation while living in property I owned was a betrayal that went beyond their resentment of the situation. By the fourth year, the tension had reached a breaking point. My parents were barely speaking to me except when necessary for holidays or major family events, and even those interactions were strained and uncomfortable. They had stopped acknowledging my ownership of the property entirely, referring to the house as ours in all conversations and making it clear through their words and actions that they viewed me as an intruder, rather than the legal owner who had saved them from foreclosure. The situation came to a head 3 weeks ago during a family dinner at my aunt's house, where the accumulated resentment finally erupted into open conflict. The gathering included my parents, my aunt and uncle, 2 cousins, and several family friends who had known our family for decades. At some point during the evening, the conversation turned to real estate and housing markets, and my cousin mentioned that she was looking to buy her first home and asked for advice about mortgages and down payments. My mother seized this opportunity to make a pointed comment about property ownership and family relationships. "Be very careful about who you accept help from when buying a house," she said, her voice laden with bitterness. "Sometimes people who claim they're helping you are actually taking control of your life and using their financial assistance to manipulate you. It's better to struggle on your own than to give someone power over you by accepting their help with something as important as housing." The comment was clearly directed at me and our situation, and everyone at the dinner table recognized the subtext even if they didn't know all the details of what had happened 4 years ago. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger as I realized my mother was publicly characterizing my rescue of them from foreclosure as manipulation and control rather than generosity and family support. "Mom, that's not fair," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite my rising emotions. "When I helped you and Dad with your housing situation, I did it because I didn't want to see you lose your home. I've never tried to control you or manipulate you through property ownership. I've just tried to ensure you had housing security without the financial stress of mortgage payments." My father immediately jumped to Denise's defense. his face reddening with anger. "You didn't help us, Bethany. You took advantage of our situation to buy our house out from under us. You knew we were vulnerable and desperate, and you used that vulnerability to gain ownership of property that should still be ours. And now you hold that ownership over our heads whenever we make decisions about our own home." The accusations were so distorted and unfair that I struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't escalate the conflict further. "Dad, you were facing foreclosure," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "The bank was going to take your house in 60 days. I purchased it to prevent that from happening and to give you a place to live without mortgage payments. I've never charged you rent. I've never threatened to evict you. And I've never held the ownership over your heads. I've just tried to help you maintain housing security." But my father wasn't interested in hearing my side of the story or acknowledging the reality of what had happened 4 years ago. "You've made our lives miserable," he said, his voice rising with anger. "Every day we wake up knowing we're living in your house, depending on your generosity, subject to your decisions about property that should be ours. You've taken away our independence and our dignity, and you've done it all while pretending you're being generous and helpful." The conversation escalated quickly, with other family members joining in to either defend me or support my parents' narrative. My aunt tried to mediate, suggesting that everyone was too emotional and should take a break from the discussion. But my mother wasn't finished expressing her resentment and anger about the situation. "We've tried to be grateful, Bethany," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "We've tried to appreciate what you did and accept that you own the house now. But we can't keep living this way, feeling like guests in our own home, worrying that you'll decide someday to sell the property or ask us to leave, knowing that our housing security depends entirely on your goodwill and continued generosity. It's humiliating and exhausting, and we're tired of pretending that this arrangement is working." The admission that they viewed the arrangement as humiliating revealed the core problem with our situation. My parents' resentment of their dependence on me had grown so intense that they could no longer separate their discomfort about needing help from their relationship with me as their daughter. In their minds, I had become the embodiment of their financial failure rather than the person who had rescued them from the consequences of that failure. I left my aunt's house that evening feeling devastated and uncertain about how to repair a relationship that had been poisoned by resentment and distorted narratives. I genuinely didn't know how to resolve the situation in a way that would satisfy my parents while also protecting my investment in the property and ensuring they maintained housing security. The conflict seemed to have no good solution. Continuing the current arrangement was clearly making everyone miserable, but any alternative seemed likely to result in my parents losing their housing or facing financial difficulties they couldn't handle. 2 days after the dinner confrontation, I received a text message from my father that was cold and formal. "Denise and I have decided we need distance from you while we figure out our living situation and our relationship with you. Please do not come to the house or contact us until we reach out to you. We need time and space to process everything that's happened and decide how we want to move forward." The request for distance was painful, but not entirely surprising given the intensity of the conflict at my aunt's house. I responded with a simple message agreeing to give them the space they requested, while emphasizing that I was always available if they wanted to talk or needed anything. I assumed this cooling-off period would last a few weeks, maybe a month, while tempers settled and everyone gained perspective on the situation. What I didn't anticipate was how that request for distance would escalate into something far more serious and legally problematic. 3 days ago, I received a text message from my mother that was shocking in its coldness and finality. "We have decided you are not part of this family anymore. Your belongings have been packed and are on the front porch. Do not try to enter the house. Your key will no longer work as we have changed the locks. Please collect your things and do not contact us again. This decision is final, and we will not change our minds." I read the message multiple times, trying to process what my mother was actually saying and what this meant for our relationship and the property situation. They were declaring that I was no longer part of the family, a statement so extreme and hurtful that it took my breath away. But more than that, they were informing me that they had changed the locks on my property and were preventing me from entering the house I legally owned. The text wasn't just an emotional declaration. It was notification of an illegal eviction of the property owner by occupants who had no legal right to exclude me from my own house. I immediately drove to the house to see if the message was accurate, or if this was some kind of emotional overreaction that would be resolved through conversation. When I arrived, I found several boxes of my belongings stacked on the front porch: photo albums, childhood mementos, personal items I'd left at the house over the years, sitting there as if I were being evicted from a property rather than being excluded from a family home I actually owned. I approached the front door and tried my key, which indeed no longer worked because the lock had been changed. I knocked on the door and called out to my parents, hoping to have a conversation about what was happening and why they felt the need to take such extreme action. My father came to the door but didn't open it, speaking to me through the closed door in a voice that was flat and emotionless. "Bethany, we told you not to come here," he said. "We've made our decision. You are not part of this family anymore, and you are not welcome in our home. Please take your belongings and leave. If you continue trying to contact us or enter the house, we will call the police and report you for trespassing and harassment." The threat to call the police on me for trespassing on property I owned was so legally absurd that under other circumstances it might have been laughable. But in that moment, standing on the porch of my own house being threatened with police action by people who were illegally occupying my property, I felt only shock and disbelief at how distorted my parents' understanding of the situation had become. "Dad, this is my house," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite my rising panic. "I own this property legally. You can't lock me out of my own house or threaten me with trespassing charges when I'm the legal owner. Whatever issues we have as a family, we need to resolve them through conversation, not through illegal eviction." But my father was unmoved by my explanation. "This is not your house. This is our home," he said through the door. "You may have your name on some paperwork, but we've lived here for over 20 years, and this is our property regardless of what legal documents say. You need to accept that your actions 4 years ago destroyed our relationship, and that we no longer consider you our daughter. Now please leave before we call the police." The complete disconnection from legal reality in my father's statement revealed how deeply my parents had convinced themselves that their years of residence somehow trumped my legal ownership, and that their declaration that I wasn't their daughter somehow voided the deed and title that proved I owned the property. They genuinely seemed to believe that they could simply declare themselves the owners and exclude me from property I had purchased with my own money to save them from foreclosure. I stood there on the porch for several more minutes, trying to decide how to respond to this situation. Part of me wanted to force the issue, call my own locksmith, gain entry to my property, and assert my legal rights as the owner. But another part of me recognized that escalating the confrontation while emotions were running so high would only make the situation worse and potentially put me in a position where my parents would indeed call the police, creating a complicated situation that would be difficult to explain, even though I was legally in the right. Instead, I made a strategic decision that would ultimately prove to be the right choice. I collected my belongings from the porch, walked away from the house, and immediately contacted my real estate attorney to initiate comprehensive legal action that would resolve this situation through the courts, rather than through family confrontation. Have you ever been illegally locked out of property you own by people who tell you you're not family while living there only because you saved them from foreclosure? That's exactly what I experienced as I loaded boxes into my car while my father watched from a window, apparently satisfied that he'd successfully expelled me from his property. My real estate attorney, Melissa Davidson, listened to my explanation of the situation with increasing alarm and concern. "Bethany, what your parents have done is illegal on multiple levels," she explained. "They've committed illegal eviction by locking out the property owner without legal proceedings. They're illegally occupying property they don't own after being asked to acknowledge your ownership rights. And if they've told other people they own the property or have made any legal claims to ownership, they may also be committing housing fraud. This is serious, and we need to address it immediately through formal legal channels." Melissa explained that I had several options for responding to my parents' illegal actions. I could seek immediate emergency court orders forcing them to allow me access to my property. I could initiate formal eviction proceedings to remove them from the house entirely. I could press criminal charges for illegal eviction and trespassing. Or I could pursue some combination of these options depending on what outcome I wanted to achieve and how I wanted to resolve the family conflict. The question you need to answer, Melissa said, is what do you actually want to happen here? Do you want to force your way back into the house and maintain the current living arrangement? Do you want to evict your parents and either sell the property or live in it yourself? Do you want to pursue criminal charges for their illegal actions? Your legal rights are clear. You own the property and they've illegally excluded you from it. But how you exercise those rights depends on what outcome you're seeking. I thought carefully about Melissa's question and about what I actually wanted to achieve through legal action. The truth was that the relationship with my parents was already destroyed. They had declared I wasn't family anymore and had taken illegal action to exclude me from their lives. There was no path back to a healthy family relationship after such extreme betrayal and such distorted understanding of reality. The only question was how to resolve the property situation in a way that protected my investment, held my parents accountable for their illegal actions, and taught them the consequences of illegally evicting someone from property they actually own. I want to initiate formal eviction proceedings, I told Melissa. I want my parents to lose the house they illegally locked me out of, and I want them to understand that declaring someone is not family doesn't change legal ownership of property. They made their choice when they changed those locks and told me I wasn't their daughter anymore. Now they can experience the consequences of that choice through legal channels that will make it very clear who actually owns the property they're occupying. Melissa drafted comprehensive legal documents that would be served to my parents through their attorney Mitchell Crawford, who they had apparently consulted during their planning of this illegal eviction. The documents included copies of the deed proving my ownership, purchase documents showing I had bought the property 4 years ago, title documentation establishing my legal rights, and evidence of the illegal lockout, including the text messages where my parents had informed me I was no longer welcome in their house. But the most devastating piece of the legal package was Melissa's letter to Mitchell Crawford, explaining the serious legal and criminal liability his clients had just exposed themselves to by illegally evicting the property owner. Your clients have committed illegal eviction under Ohio housing law by changing locks and excluding the legal property owner from her own house, the letter explained. They are currently illegally occupying property owned by Ms. Palmer without her permission and against her explicit instructions. They face potential criminal charges for illegal eviction, civil liability for damages, immediate forced eviction through emergency court proceedings, and significant financial penalties for their actions. I strongly recommend you advise your clients to immediately restore Ms. Palmer's access to her property and negotiate a resolution before these matters proceed to criminal and civil court. 1 week after my parents locked me out of my own house, Mitchell Crawford received Melissa's letter along with all the supporting documentation proving my ownership and their illegal actions. According to Melissa, who remained in contact with Crawford throughout this process, his reaction was immediate and alarmed when he realized the catastrophic legal mistake his clients had made and the serious consequences they were about to face. Crawford sent an urgent email to my parents with the subject line, "We have a problem. Call immediately," and apparently spent over an hour on the phone with them explaining that they had illegally evicted the actual property owner from her own house and now faced serious legal and potentially criminal consequences for their actions. According to Melissa, Crawford was furious with Eugene and Denise for not disclosing that I actually owned the property and for characterizing the situation as a dispute over family boundaries rather than as illegal occupation of someone else's property. Within 2 hours of Crawford's call with my parents, Melissa received a frantic phone call from him trying to negotiate a resolution. "My clients made a serious mistake," he said, his professional composure barely masking his frustration with the situation. "They didn't fully understand the legal implications of Ms. Palmer's ownership when they made the decision to change the locks. They're prepared to restore her access immediately and discuss reasonable arrangements for continued occupancy if she's willing to withdraw the eviction proceedings and criminal complaints." But Melissa's response was firm and uncompromising. "Your clients didn't make a mistake. They made a calculated decision to illegally evict the property owner from her own house while telling her she wasn't family anymore. They changed the locks, removed her belongings, and threatened to call the police on her for trespassing on property she legally owns. Those aren't the actions of people who misunderstood the situation. Those are the actions of people who believed they could simply take ownership of property through occupancy and exclusion of the actual owner. Ms. Palmer will not be withdrawing her eviction proceedings or negotiating continued occupancy. Your clients will be formally evicted from the property they illegally locked her out of, and they will face whatever additional legal consequences are appropriate given their actions. Over the next week, I received dozens of frantic calls and messages from my parents, their attorney, and various family members who had learned about the legal situation and were trying to mediate some kind of resolution. The messages alternated between apologies, justifications, denials, and desperate pleas for me to reconsider the eviction proceedings. My mother's messages were particularly revealing. "Bethany, please don't do this to us. We were emotional and made a mistake. But we're still your parents, and this is still our home. You can't actually evict us from the house we've lived in for 20 years. There must be some legal protection for long-term residents, even if someone else owns the property. Please have mercy on us and work something out." The assumption that long-term residents had legal protection against eviction by the actual property owner revealed how little my parents understood about property law and how deeply they had convinced themselves that their residency created ownership rights that superseded my legal title. Even after their attorney had explained the severity of their legal situation, they still seemed to believe there must be some way to avoid consequences for illegally locking me out of my own property. My father's messages took a different tone, alternating between aggressive defensiveness and desperate bargaining. "You're destroying your own family over property and money. Is that really who you are? We raised you better than this vindictive behavior. If you insist on pursuing this eviction, you'll lose your parents forever, and you'll have to live with that choice for the rest of your life. But if you're willing to be reasonable, we can work something out where we pay you rent or find some other arrangement that acknowledges both your ownership and our need for housing security." The suggestion that I was destroying the family by enforcing my property rights after they had illegally evicted me was particularly galling, as was the offer to pay rent after 4 years of living in my house without any financial contribution whatsoever. But what stood out most was the underlying assumption that I should prioritize maintaining family relationships over holding them accountable for illegal actions that had destroyed whatever relationship we might have had. Extended family members also reached out with messages that revealed they were still hearing a distorted version of the story from my parents. My aunt called asking why I was being so harsh with Eugene and Denise over a simple family disagreement about boundaries. My cousin sent texts suggesting I was overreacting to my parents' need for independence and that I should find a compromise that would let them maintain their dignity while I maintained ownership. The characterization of illegal eviction as a simple disagreement or a need for independence showed that my parents were still not being honest with extended family about what they had actually done. But I remained firm in my decision, and Melissa proceeded with formal eviction proceedings that would force my parents out of the property within 60 days, unless they voluntarily vacated sooner. The court filings included all the documentation of their illegal lockout, their declaration that I was not family, their threats to call police on me for trespassing on my own property, and their continued occupation of the house despite being informed they had no legal right to exclude the owner. The eviction proceedings moved forward despite my parents' attempts to contest them through their attorney. Mitchell Crawford tried several legal arguments to delay or prevent the eviction, claiming that my parents had some kind of implied tenancy that required more formal termination procedures, arguing that family relationships created special obligations that should be considered, suggesting that my 4 years of allowing them to live there rent-free created some kind of adverse possession claim. But each argument was quickly dismissed by the court because the basic facts were undeniable. I owned the property legally, they had no lease or rental agreement, they had illegally locked me out, and I was entitled to possession of my own house. 6 weeks after my parents locked me out of my own property, the court issued a final eviction order requiring them to vacate within 15 days. The order included stern language about the seriousness of their illegal actions and warnings about potential contempt charges if they failed to comply with the eviction order. Mitchell Crawford called Melissa to inform her that his clients would comply with the order and would be out of the property by the deadline. During those final 2 weeks before the eviction deadline, I received a few last desperate messages from my parents, but the tone had shifted from aggressive defensiveness to resigned acceptance of consequences. "We'll be out by the deadline," my father wrote in a text message. "We don't have anywhere to go yet, but we'll figure something out. I hope you're satisfied with destroying your parents' lives over property and legal technicalities. We loved you and raised you, but apparently that means nothing compared to ownership documents and legal rights. The attempt to frame my enforcement of property rights after their illegal eviction as me destroying their lives, rather than them experiencing consequences for their own actions, was typical of their victim mentality throughout this entire situation. But I didn't respond to these final messages, recognizing that any engagement would only prolong a relationship that was already destroyed beyond repair. On the deadline date, my parents vacated the property, leaving behind years of accumulated possessions and memories, but taking enough belongings to establish themselves in whatever temporary housing they had arranged. According to my real estate attorney, they had moved into a small apartment in a less desirable part of Columbus, with rent that consumed most of their limited income and no prospects for ever owning property again, given their damaged credit and limited financial resources. After they vacated, I hired professional cleaners and repair contractors to assess the property and prepare it for whatever I decided to do next: sell it, rent it to legitimate tenants, or perhaps use it myself. Walking through the empty house after my parents left was emotionally complex because every room held memories of my childhood, but also reminders of the resentment and betrayal that had poisoned those memories over the past 4 years. In the weeks following the eviction, I had to decide what to do with the property that had caused so much conflict and family destruction. I ultimately decided to sell the house, converting my investment back into liquid assets that I could use for my own housing and financial goals. The sale went smoothly, and I netted a reasonable profit after accounting for the original purchase price, the 4 years of expenses I'd covered, and the costs of the eviction proceedings. The proceeds from the sale allowed me to purchase a smaller but nicer house in a different Columbus neighborhood, far from my parents' new apartment and the memories associated with their property. My new home is entirely mine, with no complicated family dynamics or obligations to people who proved they didn't appreciate generosity or understand gratitude. My relationship with my parents remains completely severed, with no contact or communication since they vacated the property. Extended family members who initially criticized my decision to pursue eviction have gradually learned more details about what actually happened, not from me, but from other relatives who started asking questions and demanding honest answers from Eugene and Denise about the situation. Several family members have reached out to apologize for judging me without understanding the full story, while others have chosen to maintain relationships with my parents and distance themselves from me. The most satisfying outcome of this entire situation was learning that Mitchell Crawford, the attorney my parents hired to help them with their illegal eviction scheme, had reported their actions to the state bar as an example of potential client misconduct that he wanted on record. According to Melissa, Crawford was furious that Eugene and Denise had misrepresented the situation to him and exposed him to potential ethical violations by seeking his advice for illegal actions against the actual property owner. While no formal charges resulted from Crawford's report, the fact that their own attorney had documented their misconduct provided additional evidence of how serious their actions had been. Today, I live in my new home surrounded by possessions and memories that are entirely mine, without any complicated family dynamics or ungrateful relatives who resent my success and generosity. The experience taught me that saving people from consequences they deserve often creates resentment rather than gratitude, and that family relationships cannot survive when one party views help as humiliation and dependence as imprisonment. The lesson I learned from being illegally locked out of property I owned by parents who declared I wasn't family is that some people will never appreciate what you sacrifice for them, and that attempting to rescue people from consequences they created through their own poor choices often backfires in ways that destroy relationships and create legal nightmares. Sometimes the best thing you can do for entitled people is let them experience the full consequences of their actions. including the legal consequences of illegally evicting property owners from houses those owners purchased to save them from foreclosure. If you're dealing with family members who resent your help or who treat your generosity as control rather than love, remember that you cannot force people to appreciate what you do for them, and that continuing to support people who resent that support only creates more toxicity and conflict. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is step back and let people experience the consequences of their choices, including the consequences of illegally locking you out of property you own while declaring you're not family. The donation of my time, money, and effort to save my parents from foreclosure created nothing but resentment and eventually illegal eviction, while the decision to enforce my property rights through legal eviction taught them consequences they desperately needed to learn about gratitude, property law, and the difference between legal ownership and occupancy. People who lock you out of property you own while telling you you're not family deserve to lose that property entirely and learn painful lessons about legal rights and consequences. If this story resonated with you, and you believe that people who illegally evict property owners from houses those owners purchased to save them deserve to face legal consequences and lose the property they took for granted, please hit that subscribe button to Sweet Revenge Diaries. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that legal ownership creates rights that cannot be erased by declarations that someone is not family, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give entitled people is the education they receive through legal proceedings that teach them about property rights, gratitude, and consequences. See you in our next story.